Welcome to That Pennsylvania Witch podcast. My name is Caitlin Dawn. Thanks for joining us today. On today's episode of That Pennsylvania Witch podcast, I'd like to welcome author Kelle Ban Dea. Kelle is the author of the Pagan Portals book, Modron, Meeting the Mother Goddess. Thanks for coming on today. Hi, Kelle. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I've been so excited. I just finished your wonderful book on Modron. The full title is Modron, Meeting the Celtic Mother Goddess. What inspired you to write this book?
It happened over a period of a few years, really. I never had any sort of plans to write a pagan book. So I had an experience a few years ago at Modron Well in Cornwall, which is this sort of really old little parish well, kind of deep in the countryside in Cornwall, in the far southeast of England. And Cornwall, anyone who's been there, Cornwall is a place that's just kind of littered with holy wells and stone circles and, you know, old fairy forts. And you can't, and I mean, this is true of a lot of Britain. You can't go far without sort of tripping over one of these things, even though we're a tiny place. I went to see Modron Well, and it's a really magical little place. You sort of have to walk into this almost secret little path in this little kind of grove, and then you've got this sort of spring that just kind of bubbles up. And I remember just feeling absolutely immersed in this sense of being held and being at one with the landscape, and just kind of feeling her presence really, really strongly, and the sense that there was something there, and just bursting into tears. And I'm not really prone to those kind of experiences. I'm not someone who kind of naturally feels these things. You know, I'm usually the person who will kind of go to the stone circle and be like, yeah, I don't get it. It's a bunch of rocks, while everyone else is having this amazing kind of, you know, energy experience or whatever. So this was really new for me. When we came home from Cornwall, I started reading up everything I could about the area and about Modron in particular. And so to backtrack a little bit, I've been involved in sort of paganism and goddess spirituality going back. I mean, I'm 44 now. I think I was one of the sort of 90s teenage Wiccans on the back of The Craft. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Had a little group with my friends with the full-on robes and the wands and everything, and that kind of fell apart. But then when I went to university the first time, I discovered goddess spirituality, and that's kind of been my path to varying degree or another ever since. But I would say the last 10 years or so, I've got much more interested in, I guess, my own ancestral traditions. So that would be specifically what we sort of label the Celtic traditions, specifically Welsh and Irish, and my family are actually predominantly Irish traveller and Welsh Romani. So for anyone who's not aware, the Romani are a nomadic people who originally came from India and then kind of spread across Europe. But my ancestors on that side have been in Wales for sort of 300-400 years. It's very much embedded in the landscape there. And so I was looking into the kind of both the Irish and the Brythonic myths. But it wasn't really until I started researching Modron that I think my interest in specifically the Mabinogion and the first four branches really kind of sparked. And I just started, I was writing down kind of my experiences, the things I was finding out, just sort of in my journal over a couple of years. And then I looked at it and I was like, oh my God, this is practically a book. And I've always been a big reader of moon books, and I have a few of their pagan portals on my shelf. And I remember looking and thinking, they don't have this deity, and no one seems to. She's so obscure, and yet her history and the evidence for it goes right back to the Iron Age. She was worshipped all over Gaul, and yet is never mentioned in the later mythology, and you don't really hear Celtic pagans talk about her. So I thought, I wonder if moon books would like a portal on this goddess. And I don't think I expected them to get back and say, yes, we would. And so my sort of journal notes and ramblings kind of made it into a book, which is really great.
Oh, that's awesome. Reading about your perspective and your findings and all of the really wonderful connections that you've kind of delved into, it was a really refreshing read because you followed all of those threads. So for anybody who's listening who hasn't picked it up yet, it is a wonderful Pagan Portals book, and I absolutely recommend it. Been lucky enough to meet several of the authors that have been published by Moon Publishing, and it is just wonderful. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience at the well, because I had been to London and I've been to outside of Oxford. We took the train and I love the English countryside. I think that if I could move there, I absolutely would. So
It is
someday.
beautiful. I think we take it for granted when we live here. It is very beautiful.
It is. It's absolutely gorgeous. Just rolling hillsides and all of the hedges and oh, breathtaking, stunning, really stunning. But you're right. You cannot walk 20 feet without, well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you cannot walk for an extended time without tripping over some sort of sacred well or,
Right.
but it doesn't diminish their power.
Mm.
What you were describing earlier when we were speaking about being a bit of a skeptic, I am too. But I've had so many experiences. When we were walking up to a sacred site in Denmark recently, we were the only ones there. And we were walking up to this stave church and this burial mound. It completely just overcomes you, the feeling that you're remembering something.
Yes, yeah, that's a really good way of describing it. And I do think there might be something in the idea of ancestral memory as well,
Yeah.
because I think I don't only tend to have those experiences when I visit places.
Yeah,
Even
it's
if I don't know until afterwards, that seems to come through for me more than when I
absolutely.
say when I've visited places in other countries. I was going to say I did go to the Athena temple in Rhodes,
Oh.
and that was pretty awesome.
My friend visited Turkey, and
Mm.
went to the Temple of Apollo, was taking all of these pictures, and I want to visit all of them. But yeah, I do think that these things kind of sneak up on you.
Mm.
I didn't intend to start a podcast, for example, but I had so many brilliant experiences with authors, well, elders in my group that I just really thought could use kind of a platform to tell their story
Mm.
because that's what we're all doing. We're telling stories of the things that are important to us and we're connecting through them. But that's what your book did for me. The mother archetype, the significance of this goddess has been overlooked.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think it's interesting. Before I had that experience, I was not someone who was, and I do talk about this a little bit in the book, particularly interested in that archetype, in the mother. Even though, I mean, I have 3 children, so it's not as if I obviously have an affinity with motherhood, but I think as an archetype, as a deity, I was just never attracted to that. And so certainly wasn't looking for that. And it kind of was, I became, because she's the only goddess on my altar now. And I guess that happened almost in spite of myself and in spite of my leanings. I don't want to call it a calling. I always feel a bit cringy, but that's certainly what it felt like. I
Yeah.
can't really think of another way to describe it. But in terms of her being overlooked, I was really surprised. So I was vaguely aware before I went to Modron Well, and it's generally assumed that Modron is probably called after her. There is a Saint Modron in the Christian tradition that
Mm.
seems to have never existed, and no one knows where they came from or if they're even male or female. So it's a pretty, I think, fair assumption by scholars that it's possibly a hangover from the old sort of Celtic beliefs and
Oh,
the
yeah.
worship of Modron. But there's not a huge amount known about it, so we don't have any. So a Modron would have been originally Matrona and was a goddess worshipped across Gaul, so really all the way across Western Europe by the tribes that we call the Celts nowadays, and also by some of the Germanic tribes. It's really widespread worship. I think there's thousands of statues and sculptures and inscriptions to it. But of course, we don't have any mythology existing from that time. So unlike, say, with the Greek and the Roman gods, where we have all of these myths thanks to the likes of Homer, we don't have that for the Celtic or Germanic gods. The myths are written down a lot later. So Matrona then pops up as Modron,
Yeah.
very briefly in the Mabinogion and in the Triads. And so we don't know. The thing with the myths and the tales being written down so much later, and because they were written down by Christian clergy as well most of the time, we don't know how much are the echoes of the original myths or how much were made up on the spot, how much is propaganda, how much is, been passed down by oral tradition but possibly changed, how much is a local myth as opposed to a more widespread one. It's so difficult to pull out. So we don't really know a lot about Matrona as she originally was. As Modron, we end up with this tale of her as a sort of washerwoman. So yeah, as Modron, she turns up in a central myth in the Triads and an old Welsh manuscript as a sort of washerwoman at the ford figure, as a fairy woman. And usually the motif of the washerwoman at the ford is usually connected to death. So, for example, with the Morrigan in Ireland, you have her washing the clothes of people who have been slain in battle, almost as a foreshadowing. And it's usually quite an ominous. You have the Ban Dea in Scotland that does a similar thing. And she's kind of portrayed as this ugly old hag, sorry. But
Yeah.
with, I think I said hog because she's sometimes described as having boar's tusks.
She does, yeah, the
Yeah.
teeth or the tusks. Yeah, absolutely.
She's quite this fearsome figure. A little bit reminiscent of the Kalyak, maybe, the sort of old giantess
Yes.
goddess. But with Modron, the tale is much more gentle. She's a fertility figure. King Urian, who appears to have been a real historical figure. So we're sort of entering into kind of pseudo history here. So Modron has become, like I said, a fairy woman rather than a goddess now over the centuries. And it describes them having sex by the river. And a lot of the time, these stories tend to be rapes,
Mm.
reading between the lines. But with this one, I don't think it is. The way it's described, it seems to go back more to the older sovereignty idea, where the sort of woman of sovereignty or the goddess of the land accepts the rightful king, and they
Yes.
kind of come together. So almost as though it was this idea that the goddess of the land literally would represent the land itself, saying, I accept that you're going to be the king. And if the king, you see this in some of the King Arthur tales with the Fisher King.
Yeah.
If the king is not a good king, the land suffers, and vice versa, which in some ways is a beautiful ecological myth. And I talk about that in the book a little bit. But looked at another way is quite problematic because, if the king has any kind of disability, he can't be the king anymore. So there's some really sort of ableist ideas
Mm.
in there. You see that in Ireland as well with King Nuada when his arms chopped off in battle and he can't be king anymore. And so there's different ways of interpreting those myths. But in terms of Modron, I think she's definitely a fertility and guardian of the land figure, which is interesting when you think that she starts off as a clearly very widespreadly worshipped mother goddess figure. Her iconography as Matrona is very much around sacred springs, rivers, grain, the earth, abundance, and also, of course, motherhood. And also, I think it might be the scholar Rudolf Simek. Maybe wrong on that. I think it's him, but it's all referenced within the book. Suggests that she may also have been a midwife figure. So there's a lot going on, and yet we just don't really hear about her. And then I think she finally ends up. You have Saint Madron, who we don't know a lot about the Cornish version, but in Wales there are more stories about her. So a bit like Brede in Ireland, she becomes a saint. But there's also another kind of offshoot where the character of Morgan Le Fay in the later Arthur stories is clearly inspired by the older myth of Modron, because Morgan is also married to Urian of Reged and has a son called Owain, just as Modron does in the triad. So she's sort of come down as she's sort of gone all the way from this really important mother goddess in the Iron Age to this kind of literary witch figure, which I think is really, really interesting. How many of us are so unaware of that?
Oh, absolutely. That's an important distinction. So when we talk about the mother archetype, a lot of times that comes with a hint of submission or, there's no reciprocity, like you mentioned. It tends to be a violent thing where the mother is powerful and in some cases honored, but in most cases mistreated. And I
Yes.
think that with this specific archetype, the idea of sovereignty, I agree with you there. The mother archetype is then symbolic of the birth and the regeneration of the earth and of
Yeah,
Earth Mother.
absolutely.
You wrote of the stolen child archetype. Yeah, talking about the Demeter, Persephone, also Rhiannon, which is a unique parallel there too. I never thought align Rhiannon with Modron until I read your book.
I had no idea myself until I started researching her, but it's something scholars have been talking about for a while. But again, obviously, I guess it's quite a niche field.
Yeah.
And sort of the scholarship doesn't necessarily cross over into the neo-pagan world. So certainly I was never aware. But there's the idea that the story of Rhiannon and her son Pryderi are reflexes of Modron and her son Mabon.
Yes.
And in fact that all of the mother and son stories in the four branches of the Mabinogion may be a sort of later rendition of this older myth that we don't have. So Modron's mentioned very, very briefly in a story in the Mabinogion called, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Culhwch and Olwyn, where her son Mabon is not a central character, but a very important side character. And Mabon's this quite mysterious kind of divine youth figure who's been trapped in this fortress, and King Arthur and his knights have to rescue him, and he in order to find him, they have to communicate with the oldest animals, which is a really ancient mythological motif, as is the divine youth and the exalted prisoner. And I've actually got a separate book on Mabon coming out at the end of this month, because when I was researching Modron, I found out so much about him that I had to sort of separate the two.
Oh, I love that. It's coming out later this month.
Yeah, the 27th, I believe. But you don't have to
Oh,
read one to understand the other.
of course,
Although
but
they
I'm
obviously.
gonna include
Oh,
that
thank you.
link too, if you don't mind, because I cannot wait to
Yeah,
read
that'd be
that.
great. I was never really as interested in sort of male archetypes, if I'm honest, but it was impossible to research the mother and not come across the son. I've gone off point a little bit, but so in Mabon Smith, one of the things that's repeated over and over, and so is clearly important, is Mabon, son of Modron, who was taken from between his mother and the wall, so presumably in a crib or something like that, when he was 3 nights old, and no one knows where he went. And this is just, it's repeated over and over, and you see that motif of the stolen child, of course, with Rhiannon, and he's eventually returned to her, but she has to go through all that injustice of having her baby stolen and being accused of her doing it. And then in the second branch, in the story of Bran and Branwen, Branwen's infant son is killed. Then you have in the fourth branch, where the mother loses her infant son and then later rejects him. You have this kind of motif of the mother and the son, and there being a separation and a disruption between the mother and the son over and over. And scholars have postulated that it may go back to an older myth of Modron and Mabon that we've lost.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting. I also think there's really some really interesting modern interpretations that we can put on this. If you look at, just patriarchy, and I'm a bit of an eco-feminist, so for me, automatically the interpretation would be we're looking at that kind of separation from Mother Earth.
Oh, well,
There's a
your
lot
book
there.
made me realize, or at least arrive at that conviction myself. I was actually nerdily chatting with a friend, and I was like, "Do
Oh
you think
wow.
that these stories are a way of remembering the true myths, or a way of
Mm,
passing down the information that is palatable, so it's symbolic?"
yeah.
The myth of separation, of, something arising, whether it's an Abrahamic belief system, a socio-political whatever, that separates us from our true nature and from our roots.
I think it's possibly, and this is purely me speculating,
Sure.
so I may be completely wrong, but I think it's possible that this might have functioned in a similar way to the fall myth in the Abrahamic tradition, at some point, and of course it would have happened over probably millennia, but at some point, humanity did make this step away from, the earth and our connectedness with the land, and away from animistic folk belief and away from pantheism, and more into this, what we would call civilization. And don't get me wrong, there's some amazing things that come from that, but there's also some very awful stuff. And
Yes.
I think we remember that collectively, and I think that's possibly where some of these myths come from. And so for me, that separation of mother and the son is really powerful, and I think there's a lot of layers to that. Also, on a personal level, I've been through and sort of trigger warning here in case, for pregnancy loss and things. I've been through pregnancy loss due to domestic violence, and which was obviously really painful. And working with Modron as the sort of grieving mother now, it was really powerful medicine for me, really powerful. And I think she has that aspect as well. And I do give a little ritual, tentative ritual in the book for people who might want to work with her around things like pregnancy loss, because I think that is quite a powerful part of her archetype for me. Is she's not just the kind of the abundant mother, with the iconography of the babies at her breast and the baskets of bread and stuff. She's also very much the grieving mother. I think that's quite powerful.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry that happened to you.
Thank you.
And I just want to say how I think it is remarkably powerful that you have written these rituals. They're beautiful. They're beautifully written, but it's kind of like a reclaiming of power. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that, and I'm so sorry that it happened.
I think for me, one of the strengths, I think, of not just goddess spirituality, but various types of paganism, is that ability to craft rituals that speak into your life. And that's not a dig on people who follow more sort of orthodox beliefs with more repetitive rituals, because there's power in that as well. I come from a very lapsed Irish Catholic family, and there is a beauty in the rosary and the mass and all the rest of it, and doing those same movements and things every week. But I think it's also really important to be able to craft rituals that speak to you and what you're going through and to your community, that sort of ever widening circle. And I think paganism, modern paganism, really allows us to do that without feeling guilty about it. I
Yeah.
think there can be a sense sometimes, certainly, I mean, I only really know the Christian tradition, but I think if you kind of try and go off base and do something a bit different, there's usually someone who will tell you you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Whereas in paganism, we have more freedom, I think, to, okay, this is my path. This is how I need to practice.
Absolutely. I grew up Catholic and I didn't
Mm.
leave behind those traditions. I
Yeah.
have my grandmother's rosary. I pray on the
Yeah.
rosary. I still, as a child, Mary was my absolute that was my that was my focus.
Yeah.
Um, and that was absolutely the reason why I eventually leaned into paganism and walked down this path because with animistic beliefs, you do have that sense of sovereignty. We're bringing it up
Yeah.
again, but
Yeah.
hey, it's important because I think that doing something that resonates with you or that helps you feel that connection is going to be so much more powerful than something that somebody else has written. It's just, it's a wonderful, wonderful dynamic. I was really excited to see Mahara Starling reviewed your book. And I just met Mahara, and she is lovely. But I had the privilege of sitting in and participating in a ritual led by Christopher Hughes and
Oh,
Mahara
wow.
Starling at the Sacred Space Conference. I think I told you this earlier, but it bears
Mm.
repeating because it was to honor Caradwyn. And it was just so lovely. It was beautifully done. Hearing it in Welsh was extremely powerful. I
Beautiful
always
language.
Oh, yeah. I always tell people, the meaning can come through. I understood every fifth word, but,
Mm.
not to worry. Looked it up afterwards, but just absolutely breathtaking. And hearing, hearing that in person was spectacular because it really does. It's almost like it strikes those chords of resonance that you are remembering, or maybe your mitochondrial DNA is
Mm.
remembering or something.
There's something going on, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And when I got to the part about you reference the spoils of Anun,
Hmm.
and that journey to the underworld. And I agree. They do think that what does it date back to? They think that potentially it dates back to the fifth or sixth century.
Yeah, it's really old.
Yeah,
Really
it feels
oldest.
old.
One of the oldest sort of Brythonic, some of the oldest material we have, I think. But it's really obscure. I know
It is.
scholars and pagans have been arguing over this poem for decades now. It's difficult to work out what's going on, but you have the obvious kind of descent to the underworld or crossing into the other world, however you want to however that fits into your cosmology. But there's also all the things around the kind of the cauldron,
Yes.
the priestesses, the nine priestesses around the cauldron. There's the motif of the captured divine youth in there. I talk about this a bit more in Mabon, actually, because it's kind of a really central motif, I think, in quite a lot of the Brythonic material. And again, we don't know for definite what it was trying to say. It's
Right.
very open to interpretation. But yeah,
Right.
the connection with the other world is definitely there with Modron.
Oh, I think so too. Reading that, it reminded me, and I know I told you that if anybody has the ability to find, it's very hard to find, and I'll send you a copy, Kelly, because I think that you'll
Oh,
enjoy
wow.
hearing it. Robin Williamson, who is a bard, right? He's a singer. He did a series of Celtic myths and
Oh, wow.
has a song called The Spoils of Anun. And it is so powerful. When I heard it the first time, it was almost like I absolutely remembered it. It's that ancient poem that you did refer to,
Yeah,
you referenced in your book as
yeah.
well. But hearing that maybe 10 years ago when I heard that for the first time, it was so powerful that I burst into tears. And I am a Capricorn. I don't do that. Like that's not a thing that I do. I don't do that. I was like, what is this moist stuff coming out of my eyes? This isn't happening. So I resonated with that because it just reminded me of that story, and hearing you reference it in your book was spectacular. Yeah, I also am a big skeptic half the time. The other half of the time, I'm like, this is the most spectacular thing in the world, and it's very powerful and has to be true. But then the other half of the time, I'm a skeptic as well.
Do
But
you find
these,
you're constantly at war with yourself?
yes, yes.
Yeah. Mm.
It's so powerful to research them. I mean, and your work is spectacular. I can tell you put so much work into this. Oh, and you mentioned the Glastonbury Goddess Temple.
Yeah, I have visited the temple. It's a really beautiful space. They've worked really hard to set up. It's just the most gorgeous space. I don't know a huge amount about their tradition. It's like a newer Avalonian tradition. And it's just so amazing, I think, that the landscape in Glastonbury has inspired its own kind of neo-pagan tradition centered around, the goddesses of, or the women of Brythonic mythology. I think is amazing. But yeah, I do reference it in the book because they mention Modron.
Yeah.
And there's another Avalonian tradition by, oh, I should know her name. She's another Moon Books author. She wrote the book Rhiannon, which is really a really popular. Pagan
Yeah.
Portals. Why can I not remember her name? Jenna Tillindrew, I think.
Oh, lovely.
She
I have
runs
to.
the Sisterhoods of Avalon, and I know Madron is also mentioned briefly in her books. And she also goes into a little bit about Matrona and Morgan and the links there as well.
Yeah.
So I drew on her work. I think I've referenced her in the book. Um, so I feel like really Modron is kind of everywhere in the Celtic tradition, but you just have to dig for her a little bit. But I think she really underpins all of it.
I really do think so too. I think very important aspect.
Mm.
Very important. I love your Substack. If it's okay, I'm
Thank
going to
you.
include a link to it because I
That'd
think
be
your writing is
great.
spectacular. And I really like what you said. I love how you're bringing common sense into something that brilliantly you write about the interpretation of fairies and the fae and how sometimes it can be very detrimental and dangerous that we're bringing up certain things that we don't necessarily need to draw parallels to.
Mm.
And we're bringing kind of the parts of it forward sometimes that aren't going to be very beneficial for us to study. And I also book is Mabon, and it's going to be
Yes.
out on the 27th. Are you working on anything else right now?
Yes. So I've just finished working on a book on Anya, the Irish goddess, who I see some parallels with Madron actually, but I think she has a much darker aspect, Anya. And so that comes out in November. And I'm halfway through another one on Airmid, the Irish goddess of herbal medicine, she only has this like really tiny part in one of the myths, the Irish myths. And so there's been a lot of speculation about whether she was even an original deity, or whether she was sort of inserted by the medieval scribes. But what's really interesting, and why I think she's worth studying, is her role in Irish traveller folklore. So I'm of Irish traveller and Welsh Romany ethnicity, and I was always told this story of how the reason Irish travellers have quite a lot of herbal knowledge and rely on herbal medicine is because we were taught it by the fairies or by a particular fairy woman. And I came across the work of an Irish traveller author called Why the Moon Travels, which is a beautiful book, which I definitely recommend. And he writes that story, and it turns out that the story of us being taught herbal medicine from the fairies is actually comes from the story of Airmid. And so this whole tradition of Airmid, this really rich tradition naming specific herbs with a really much expanded story that's in the traveller tradition that's only obviously recently been told. So she's a much more interesting and complex figure than you'd know from just sort of studying the medieval myth. Unfortunately, I've had to take a pause for health reasons and sort of increasing disability. I have something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and my joints are starting to degenerate quite a bit. So I'm not sure when I'm going to be able to pick that up. I'm trying to get to grips with speech to text software so I can perhaps finish it that way, because my plan when I'd finished Airmid was to start writing a longer book around my plan was to call it, I don't have a full sort of plan for it yet, but I have this title in my head called sort of Deep Green Witchcraft. And I
Oh,
wanted to really dig into kind of the folklore, my own sort of ancestral folklore in particular, and the way we use that to sort of weave ourselves back into the land without sort of being sidetracked by what I would sort of call the woo.
yes.
Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but I think there's a space in which witchcraft and paganism can be really deep and really rich and really has something to say for all the current crises of the world. I think that's worth digging into,
Yes,
as
I
much as
think so
it's
too.
it's fun to skip around with a wand and and go to, dress up and stuff. But I think there's something really sort of powerful there that we can engage with when it comes to healing the climate crisis and just, so much of the stuff at the minute. And I won't go into politics, but I know we said earlier, there's a lot happening right now
There's
that's,
a lot happening right now. It's hard not to even, it's hard to shy away from the topic sometimes.
yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that there are tangible things that we can do. And I'm sorry, I guess how can you call yourself a witch if you're not concerned about ecology? If you're not concerned about preserving our natural spaces and that sort of thing? Because and I say personally, I recognize that there is no separation between us and
Mm,
nature. That's
yeah.
part of my core belief, my core value system, really. And I think it's important to fight for that. It's important to stand up for what you believe in because that's part of sovereignty too.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that's
yeah. I cannot wait to read your next book. I am very
it.
excited. And I just really wanted to say thank you for coming on today.
Thanks for
And
having
I
me. It's been
think,
really fun. Thank you.
hey,
You
thank
asked some great
you.
questions. I was able to really dig into the topic.
I've really enjoyed your perspective. I appreciate you coming on today, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.
You too. Thank you.